When someone with narcissistic tendencies hurts you, one of the first things they try to hide is their own sense of guilt. On the outside, they may look calm, confident, and completely unaffected by what happened. They may act as if the situation meant nothing to them, or as if you were simply overreacting. But beneath that surface, there is often an uncomfortable awareness that they crossed a line. The problem is that admitting guilt requires honesty and responsibility, and those two things threaten the image they carefully protect. A narcissistic personality depends heavily on appearing strong, right, and superior. Accepting blame would challenge that identity, so instead of acknowledging what they did, they begin to protect themselves psychologically. They might minimize the situation, pretend the event was not serious, or convince themselves that you somehow caused the problem. This internal defense allows them to avoid the emotional discomfort that comes with accountability. To the outside world, they appear certain and justified, but internally, they are working hard to silence the voice that reminds them of their actions. That hidden guilt does not disappear. It is simply buried under layers of denial, rationalization, and self-protection. Because that guilt is uncomfortable, they often redirect attention away from their behavior. One common way they do this is by shifting the focus onto your reaction rather than their actions. Instead of addressing the harm they caused, they talk about how you responded. They may say you became too emotional, too sensitive, or too difficult to deal with. This shift allows them to maintain control of the narrative while avoiding responsibility. It creates a situation where the conversation is no longer about what they did, but about how you responded afterward. Over time, this tactic can even cause you to question your own memory or feelings. You may start wondering if you misunderstood the situation or if your reaction was somehow the real problem. But what is happening is much simpler. The narcissistic individual is protecting themselves from the discomfort of admitting wrongdoing. They hide their guilt by turning the spotlight onto you, because as long as the conversation revolves around your behavior, their own actions remain unexamined. Even though they hide it well, that suppressed guilt can influence their behavior in subtle ways. Sometimes it appears as irritation when the past is mentioned, or as defensiveness when someone questions their actions. Instead of calmly discussing what happened, they may become dismissive or impatient. That reaction is not random. It is often a sign that the topic touches something they would rather keep buried. When guilt remains unresolved, it creates tension inside a person. Rather than confronting that tension, a narcissistic personality tries to eliminate the reminder. They might avoid the conversation completely, or they may act as though the entire situation was insignificant. But ignoring guilt does not remove it. It simply pushes it deeper, where it continues to influence their reactions. What they want most is to move forward without ever having to acknowledge the damage they caused. For the person who was hurt, understanding this dynamic can bring a certain kind of clarity. It explains why genuine apologies are rare in these situations. A sincere apology requires self-reflection, empathy, and the willingness to accept responsibility. Those qualities directly challenge the protective identity that narcissistic individuals build around themselves. Instead of offering that vulnerability, they choose denial because it feels safer. That choice may leave you feeling confused or frustrated, especially if you hoped for recognition of what happened. But their refusal to admit guilt is not a reflection of your experience or your worth. It is a reflection of their inability to face the truth about themselves. Recognizing that reality can help you stop searching for validation from someone who is determined to avoid accountability. Sometimes the most powerful step forward is accepting that the closure you deserve will not come from their honesty, but from your own understanding of what truly happened. After causing emotional damage, many narcissistic personalities begin a quiet process that most people do not immediately recognize. They start rewriting the story, not on paper, not formally, but in conversations, explanations, and small comments they make to others. The goal of this rewriting is simple: protect their image. A narcissistic person invests a great deal of energy into appearing reasonable, intelligent, and justified in their decisions. When a relationship ends in pain or conflict, that image becomes threatened. If the truth were told openly, people might see their manipulation, their dismissive behavior, or the emotional harm they caused. That possibility creates pressure they do not want to face. So they reshape the narrative in subtle ways. They might say the relationship became impossible because the other person was too sensitive or too demanding. They might suggest they tried their best but were constantly misunderstood. Notice what happens in that version of events. Their actions fade into the background while your reactions become the center of the story. This rewriting does not always sound dramatic or obvious. In fact, it often sounds calm and reasonable. That is what makes it effective. By the time the story reaches others, it feels balanced and believable, even though key details have quietly disappeared. This process of rewriting the story also serves another purpose. It allows the narcissistic individual to reshape reality for themselves, not just for others. Human beings naturally want to see themselves as good, fair, and justified. When someone acts in a harmful way, that self-image becomes difficult to maintain. Instead of confronting the contradiction, a narcissistic personality solves the problem by adjusting the story. If they convince themselves that they were pushed into their behavior, then their actions no longer feel wrong. If they believe the other person created the conflict, then they can view themselves as the victim rather than the cause. Over time, this internal version of the story becomes very real to them. They may repeat it so often that they genuinely believe it. This is why discussions about the past with such individuals can feel frustrating or confusing. You may remember events clearly, but they describe those same moments in a completely different way. It is not always deliberate deception. It is often a psychological defense that allows them to live comfortably with their choices. For the person who experienced the hurt, hearing these altered versions of the story can be deeply unsettling. You might hear that you were difficult, dramatic, or impossible to satisfy. When those statements reach mutual friends or family members, it can create the feeling that your experience is being erased. That feeling is painful because it touches something fundamental, the need to have your reality acknowledged. But it is important to understand what is happening beneath the surface. The rewritten story is not about discovering truth, it is about preserving reputation. A narcissistic personality believes that if people see the full picture, their status and influence will suffer, so they control the narrative as carefully as they once tried to control the relationship. Understanding this behavior can change the way you respond. When you recognize that the narrative has been altered, you no longer feel the same pressure to correct every detail or defend yourself in every conversation. Trying to fight every distorted version of the story often keeps you trapped in the same emotional conflict. Instead, clarity becomes your strength. You know what happened. You understand the patterns that led to the harm. That understanding allows you to step away from the battle over perception. The narcissistic individual may continue presenting their version of events, but your healing does not depend on their honesty. It depends on your ability to trust your own memory and move forward with confidence in the truth you experienced. One of the realities many people overlook after being hurt by a narcissistic personality is the deep fear that person has of losing emotional control over you. While they may appear confident and unaffected, much of their behavior during the relationship was built around influence. They wanted to shape how you felt, how you reacted, and even how you saw yourself. Control over the emotional environment allowed them to stay in a position of importance. When you were upset, trying to explain yourself, or searching for their approval, the focus remained on them. Your emotions kept them at the center of the relationship. After the damage occurs and distance begins to grow, that dynamic changes in a way they do not like. Suddenly, you begin to reclaim your emotional independence. Instead of reacting to every message or every criticism, you start stepping back. That shift may seem small from the outside, but to someone who depends on emotional control, it feels like a loss of influence. The fear they hide is not simply about the relationship ending. It is about losing the ability to shape your reactions and maintain the position they once held in your life. Because of that fear, they often try subtle ways to regain that emotional connection, even if the relationship itself is already damaged. Sometimes this appears as unexpected messages, indirect comments through mutual friends, or small reminders of the past. These actions are not always about rebuilding the relationship in a healthy way. Instead, they are often attempts to see whether they can still trigger a response from you. A reaction, even a negative one, reassures them that they still occupy space in your mind. If you become angry, defensive, or eager to prove your point, they can still influence the emotional atmosphere. In their mind, that influence means they have not completely lost control. What they rarely admit is how important those reactions are to them. They prefer to appear as though they moved on easily, but their behavior often reveals a continued interest in whether you still respond to them emotionally. What unsettles them most is when your reactions begin to change. When someone who was once deeply involved in the conflict becomes calm, distant, and focused on their own life, the narcissistic individual loses the feedback they relied on. Silence and emotional independence remove the stage where they once directed the conversation. Without that stage, they cannot easily manipulate the situation or regain the attention they expect. This is why you may notice frustration or attempts to provoke a reaction if you stop engaging the way you once did. Your calmness interrupts the pattern they depended on. They cannot easily understand how someone they once influenced so strongly is now choosing not to participate in the emotional drama. For the person who was hurt, recognizing this hidden fear can bring a new level of clarity. It explains why certain behaviors continue even after the relationship appears to be over. It also shows why maintaining emotional boundaries is so powerful. When you refuse to return to the cycle of reaction and explanation, you begin to remove the influence they once had over your emotional state. That does not mean the past disappears, but it does mean the power dynamic changes. Instead of trying to manage their behavior or prove your perspective, you focus on protecting your own peace. Over time, that shift becomes one of the most important steps in rebuilding confidence and emotional stability after the relationship has ended. Another truth that often remains hidden is how closely a narcissistic personality watches your reaction after the damage is done. On the surface, they may appear distant, indifferent, or completely uninterested in what you are doing with your life. They may act as though the relationship meant little to them and that moving forward was effortless. But appearances can be misleading. People with strong narcissistic tendencies often remain highly aware of how others respond to them, especially someone they once had emotional influence over. Your reaction becomes a quiet measurement of their importance. If you appear devastated, constantly talking about the past or struggling to move forward, it confirms the belief that they had a strong impact on your life. In their mind, that impact reinforces their sense of significance. They may never say this openly, but knowing that you are still emotionally affected can give them a sense of control even after the relationship has ended. What they hide is how much attention they actually pay to those signals, because admitting that attention would contradict the image of indifference they try so carefully to maintain. This awareness does not always happen in obvious ways. They might not contact you directly or openly ask about your life. Instead, they gather information indirectly. They may listen carefully when mutual friends mention your name, observe your behavior in shared environments, or notice subtle changes in how you carry yourself. Even small details can attract their attention. Are you still reacting to things connected to them? Are you still trying to explain your side of the story? Do you appear confident and calm, or unsettled and uncertain? These observations help them evaluate whether their influence remains. The reason this monitoring stays hidden is because it conflicts with the persona they want to display. A narcissistic personality prefers to appear detached and unaffected, as though they have already moved on to something better. Admitting that they are paying attention to your emotional state would reveal a level of concern they do not want others to see. What often surprises them is when the person they hurt begins to change in ways they did not expect. If you slowly rebuild your confidence, focus on your goals, and stop reacting to the past, the signals they observe begin to shift. Instead of seeing someone trapped in the emotional aftermath, they see someone who is becoming stronger and more independent. That change challenges the narrative they created about the relationship. They may have believed that their influence would leave a permanent mark on your life, but your progress tells a different story. Even if they never acknowledge it, witnessing your growth can create discomfort. It forces them to recognize that the control they once believed they had was not as lasting as they imagined. For the person who experienced the hurt, understanding this hidden observation can bring a powerful sense of freedom. It means your healing is not only helping you rebuild your life, it is also quietly shifting the dynamic that once existed. You do not need to prove anything or demonstrate your strength through confrontation. Simply focusing on your well-being changes the message they receive. Your calm progress speaks more clearly than arguments ever could. Over time, the attention they once placed on your pain begins to encounter something they did not expect to see: resilience, growth, and a life that continues forward without their influence. Behind the confident and sometimes arrogant exterior, a narcissistic personality often hides deep insecurity. This insecurity is rarely obvious because much of their life is spent building and maintaining a public image of superiority, strength, and control. They want to appear flawless, capable, and unshakable, but that image requires constant reinforcement. When someone they have hurt begins to regain control of their life, to rebuild confidence, and to move forward without them, it quietly threatens that carefully constructed identity. The more independent and strong you become, the more it exposes cracks in the persona they have projected for so long. They hide this insecurity because admitting it would make them appear vulnerable, something they have learned to avoid at almost any cost. This concealed fragility drives much of their behavior, from subtle manipulation to outright criticism, as they attempt to maintain the illusion of control. What they hide then is not merely their self-doubt, but the fear that someone they once influenced can now exist fully and confidently without them. In practical terms, this insecurity can lead to behavior that appears dismissive, sarcastic, or critical toward the person they have hurt. They may downplay your accomplishments, act as though your progress is unimportant, or offer backhanded compliments that are really veiled attempts to reassert dominance. Their reactions are not necessarily about the specific details of your life. They are about protecting the narrative that you are somehow still within their sphere of influence. Your success, independence, or calmness can make them uncomfortable because it reminds them that their control was never permanent. The insecurity they hide fuels the need to appear superior even when circumstances prove otherwise. Understanding this allows you to see that much of their behavior is defensive, aimed at self-preservation rather than objective judgment. It is a shield that hides fear beneath the surface, maintaining an image that does not reflect their true internal state. Interestingly, this insecurity also explains why narcissistic individuals are often so attuned to your reactions. If you respond with anger, frustration, or continued attention, it reassures them that their influence remains. If you respond with calm, detachment, or focused personal growth, it challenges them in ways they cannot easily manage. Your confidence highlights the very vulnerability they conceal. Even if they never acknowledge it, your progress forces them to confront the reality that their control was temporary, and their image is not as secure as they wanted the world to believe. This dynamic is subtle and often invisible to outsiders, which is why many people do not understand the depth of the impact when someone refuses to remain emotionally dependent on a narcissistic personality. What they hide is the uncomfortable awareness that they are not invincible and that your life can flourish independently of their influence. For the person who has been hurt, recognizing this hidden insecurity can be empowering. It means that the negative comments, dismissive behavior, or subtle manipulations are less about your worth and more about their fragile self-image. You no longer need to internalize their reactions or seek validation from them. Your growth and resilience highlight their insecurities, and by continuing to focus on your own path, you effectively reclaim the power that was once misdirected. Understanding the underlying fear behind their behavior allows you to step away from attempts to control your perception and to embrace your strength fully. It shifts the focus from proving yourself to anyone else to trusting your own judgment, building a life of independence, and recognizing that their hidden vulnerability has no bearing on your value or your journey forward.